if there is any falsehood that the Nigerian people have swallowed, is the indivisibility or the facade, that, oh, the military is one entity that, cannot be divided. That's not true. In fact, it is that same institution that is deeply divided, if we would speak the truth. Because if you are going to get the solutions to your problems, you would better come out clear and speak them out.
All right, welcome back. Well, we're talking security now. Well, yeah, we all do know. Lots of meetings have been held, but the thing about this is the figures. Let's look at some of these figures. What do they tell us? And perhaps it could be a guide to what we should be doing moving forward. So we've got Babajide Ogunsaro, data analyst. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Good morning, Chamberlain.
Well, it's not just the spendings for security and the budget spendings or the security votes that have to do with numbers, but what have we been doing in terms of how have we approached this? What do you see? Do you see a pattern in the numbers that you've looked on behind the scenes?
There's a lot to talk about if we have enough time, but I'd like to start with the theory first, and then we'll look at the numbers, because with security, I've been trying to look at how can we simplify it. And I think for me, this represents the security problem in Nigeria, the Rubik's Cube. If you focus on this, you will ask yourself, how do you solve this? There's a world record, and I'll share the world record with you. But no matter how complex this is, the only solution to this is to first understand the problem. To understand the technique, and then you'll be able to solve it. But no matter how much you focus on this, if you don't understand the problem, if you don't know the technique, you will never get the solution.
And you can't throw money to solve the problem.
No, you can't throw money to solve the problem. And Peter Drucker, the renowned management consultant, had said erroneous assumptions are dangerous. This morning, I'd like to talk about top 3 things that no one has really told you about regarding the security situation, and then we'll go into the numbers. So, because it allows us to understand the problem. The first is I'd like to talk about one local government in Adamawa State called Song. That's the first thing I'd like to talk about. Now, Song is just one of 21 local governments in Adamawa State. But have you heard that just this local government, Song, is larger than the size of Lagos State? Just one local government in that state where you have a lot of terrorists. Now, that isn't the point. The point is Song is not even the largest local government in Adamawa State. Yeah. That's the first point, and I want you to think about the implications of that. The second is in Borno State. Borno State, with its land area of 75,000 square kilometers. Now, Borno State is larger than Ogun, Oyo, Osun, Ondo, and Ekiti State combined. Statement of fact. That is another state that the war is going on. Let's talk about Yobe, the third state that there's severe insecurity. Yobe State is larger than all the 5 states in the southeast region combined. Now, what I'm saying is there are some local governments in Nigeria that are bigger than states. There are some states that are bigger than regions.
So that gives us an idea of if you need to marshal out your security strategy or plan or architecture in terms of deployment, that is the kind of size you're looking at.
There are some regions that are bigger than countries. The northeastern region is bigger, way bigger than Ghana. And so it allows us to understand that the size is a major problem. If I were to summarize it, I would say our ungoverned spaces plus underdevelopment is husband and wife, and they've given birth to a child. Ungoverned spaces and underdevelopment has given birth to a child called poverty. Now, poverty has given birth to many children, grandchildren, and it now has great-grandchildren. So that allows us to understand the problem.
Before you veer off that for a bit, on the one hand are these ungoverned spaces, but then you want to look at the population of those spaces that are ungoverned. Isn't it relevant?
It is relevant, and the population leads us to that discussion on poverty, Chamberlain. Because the evidence we have today shows that all the states in the northwestern region, without exception, have a poverty rate of above 40%. All the states in the northeastern region have a poverty rate of above 50%. And the north central is sandwiched by two regions that have extreme poverty. And that allows us to really understand the challenges that we face. We are quick to throw a solution that, let's change the service chiefs. But the evidence, Chamberlain, shows that thinking is obsolete. What do I mean? Since this war started in 2001, the evidence shows that we've had 8 chief of naval staffs, we have had 8 chief of air staff, we have had 9 chief of army staffs, we've had 9 chief of defense staffs. In other words, since 2001, we've had 34 senior military officers. Yet, the war still goes on. So the thinking of we changing service chiefs or changing the military every time we have a problem, the evidence shows the war is still going on. And so our thinking has become that which is similar to the Choluteca River. And I'm sure you've heard that story whereby what was thought to have become a solution quickly became obsolete. And I think you should read up on the Choluteca River story.
Don't forget that argument notwithstanding, there's a natural progression of laws, promotions, graduations, which should take its natural course. You know, whether or not they unilaterally want to change that, but that stays on its own. But let's bring it back down a little bit. 2015, you looked at the global terrorist report in terms of the attacks. What did you see?
So we could start from 2015, or we could start from even understanding what is going on globally, how other countries have fought their wars. And if we focus on that, to look at how much countries invested whenever they found themselves in wartime. Now, once we focus on that, here's what you notice. Focusing on those top 10 countries you had mentioned, Chamberlain.
Yeah.
Since 2015 to 2018, these are the top 10 countries that have seen the most terrorist attacks. Nigeria is ranked number 6 among the top 10 countries that have had the most terrorist attacks since 2015, with over 2,000 terrorist attacks since 2015. We have Iraq number 1, Afghanistan number 2, and then we also have India, Philippines, and other countries on that list. But the challenge is the rate at which terrorism is growing makes us think, what are the alternative solutions? Because like you said, it's important for there to be progression, but the evidence shows that perhaps the change isn't really what we should focus on. We should focus on the problems. And what we've seen is the next thing, which is we are underfunding the war on terrorism. And so countries, in the United States, in World War I, World War II, 1939 to 1945, the evidence showed that when that war started, between 1939 to 1945, the United States spent up to 40% of their GDP on military expenditure. You heard me right. The United Kingdom spent 42% of their GDP on military expenditure. During the Second World War, Japan spent 99% of their GDP on military expenditure.
You know, the challenge here is, those are the issues. But then we are not in a war right now, but we are having insurgency and all of those things. So There are other agencies of government fighting security other than the military, and how come it seems like we're paying more attention to those?
Because the military seems to have been the last resort. It's our last resort. And the challenge is, if the previous solutions hadn't worked, the emphasis should have been on the police. But because the National Bureau of Statistics released a report about 2 years ago that showed the police as being one of the institutions Nigerians ranked as being highly corrupt. So the police is suffering from a trust deficit. And that trust deficit, that gap hasn't been closed. And so we've turned and moved our focus from the police to the armed forces. But the armed forces too have challenges. The land area, ungoverned spaces, that isn't their primary responsibility to develop the spaces. Poverty, illiteracy, we have weak borders. So there are several functions that are not direct functions of the military that they have become involved in. And let's not forget that in 2001, when this war started, we had a capacity problem. Let's say it as it is. The evidence shows that the armed forces were not equipped. They didn't have that skills. The soldiers, the naval officers, the Air Force staff, they didn't have the skills to fight this sort of guerrilla warfare.
Did this stat indicate that General Abacha's time actually spent 6% of our military expenditure in terms of the GDP? Is that saying he spent more than all of this combined?
Yeah, so
separately?
So what the evidence from the World Bank and our World in Data NGOs have shown is that General Abacha spent the most so far on military expenditure. So during this period, 1994 to 1998, 6% of Nigeria's GDP was on military expenditure. But what we've seen consistently is, if you look at that bottom red, the evidence is that military presidents spent more on military equipments than civilian presidents. From President Obasanjo to President Umaru Yar'Adua to President Jonathan to the sitting presidents, at the most, only 1% of GDP goes on military expenditure.
That's curious, given that we fought a war and it wasn't Abacha that was at the top, there was gone.
So what this also shows is that with military presidents, because they're not following the constitution, they can direct funds based on their preferences. In the civilian, with democracy, there are other ministries that are fighting for resources. And so a civilian president doesn't have as much flexibility to invest in military expenditure, especially in Nigeria, where even the revenue to the federal government and to the federation has been on the decline. And that is one major problem. Like I said, during the war the United States faced in World War II, 40% of GDP went on military. Now we're facing insurgency, we're facing a war. We are struggling to invest 1% in the military. And that is a challenge.
All right. We'll come back and conclude and find out, could they have done more? That's when we return. Stay with us.
The men under arms are too few. The battle space for in the northeast is too big. Borno state is bigger than Belgium. Sambisa forest is bigger than Lagos, Ikorodu, Epe, and Badagry. How many men are you putting there? Now they have super camps, so certain areas are protected. Between the super camps, there are large expanse of land that is not governed. So for me, if you do not at least double the strength of those soldiers, you will fight until eternity.
All right, welcome back. Well, Jide, looking at this, it raises a lot of questions for people because many would have thought, so all of this, trillions that they see being approved for the president by National Assembly, they would have thought, wait a minute, that's a huge chunk of money that is being supposed to reflect on this military spend.
Yeah, Chamberlain.
We're not talking about the result anyway.
Chamberlain, about 5 years ago, we were here together and I referred to the Nigerian budget as chicken change. I still stand by it. Our budget we shouldn't be talking about a 10 trillion naira budget. For the size of the country, for the size of the problems we face relative to what other developed nations are doing per person, per capita, we should be talking now about 100 trillion naira budget, a 200 trillion naira budget. And so the budget for every ministry of Nigeria in Nigeria is chicken change. The budget of the Ministry of Defense is chicken change. Oh yes, you had mentioned the Civil War. Gowon spent about 3% of Nigeria's GDP. If you look at the amount of money that went into the Civil War between 1967 to 1970, approximately 3%, that was the value of GDP, went to
That was
military.
the oil boom.
And that was the oil
When they
boom.
spoke about money was not the problem.
But consistently, since 2001 that the war started, Nigeria has been spending below 1% every year on military expenditure relative to the size of the GDP.
It's also curious, sorry, Jiditu, but it's also curious that during the military, we spent more. But during civilian rule, we spent so much less. What's responsible for
Even former military men in civilian
that?
guard.
Yes.
Because during the civilian rule, all revenue has declined. We haven't been able to get other sources of revenue. Population has increased. Infrastructure decay has happened. And several other ministries are jostling for funds. And so every leader is faced with a lower pool of funds and more needs. And so the allocation to the Ministry of Defense is also being challenged by the need to spend on other ministries. But let's, by no stretch of the imagination, make mistakes by saying that the problem to Nigeria's, or the solution to Nigeria's problem, is only the lack of funding. Like the Rubik's Cube, the solution is to first understand the problem and understand the technique. This, no matter how complex it is, has been solved in as little as 40 seconds.
From the figures that you've seen,
40 seconds.
does it give you the impression that we understand the problem, and do our spending reflect so?
I'll say this, by Dan G.K. Chesterton had also said it. It's not that we cannot find the solution. It is that we cannot see the problem. And the problem is complex. And we need to understand the technique. We need to understand that there are several moving parts. Leadership, yes, is one moving part, but leadership is not only the moving part. There's poverty, there are ungoverned spaces, there's skill gap, there's capacity, there's corruption, there's a lot, and there are issues. So, but once we can focus and understand that the problem isn't just limited to one thing, then we'll understand. There was a time, there was a nightclub in Brazil some years ago that caught fire. And almost everyone in that nightclub died. And that was because everybody was trying to run out of only one entrance. Now, the moral of that story is that if there's only one way, if there's only one solution to a problem, very soon that solution will become the problem.
All right, then, Jide Ogunson, our data analyst, thank you for your thoughts there. And those figures, they're worth a second look. We will be back in a moment and perhaps look at more figures. Join us again.